They say destiny works in ways we cannot predict, weaving lives together when we least expect it, pulling threads from the most painful struggles and stitching them into stories of hope. And if you had walked into a small supermarket on the edge of the city on any ordinary evening, you might never imagine that inside, behind the tired smile of a young woman stacking shelves, a life-changing story was waiting to unfold. Her name was Jane, and although she looked like just another worker trying to make it through a long shift, Jane carried dreams bigger than the aisles of that store could ever contain. She was 24 years old, with tired eyes that revealed sleepless nights spent studying law textbooks after endless hours at work. Her hair was often tied in a messy bun, and her uniform never seemed to fit quite right. But nothing about her appearance mattered compared to the fire burning quietly inside her chest. Jane wanted to become a lawyer, not because of wealth, not for status, but because she believed in fairness, in justice, and in helping those who never had a voice. But dreams like that were expensive. Tuition bills arrived like clockwork, heavy reminders of how much further she had to go. And so, every morning, Jane put on that uniform, clocked in at the supermarket, and gave pieces of herself to a job that drained her spirit little by little. Her boss, Mr. Clayton, was a man people described in whispers, a presence that poisoned the air. He was strict without reason, cruel without hesitation. He seemed to take pleasure in belittling her, in pointing out the smallest mistake, in reminding her that she was just an employee and nothing more. Jane learned to swallow her anger, to nod silently when he criticized her in front of others, and to pick herself up when her heart wanted nothing more than to quit. But quitting wasn't an option. Not when her dream depended on this paycheck. Not when she had no family to support her and no safety net to fall back on. And yet, there was something in Jane that he could never touch. Every night after her shift, no matter how exhausted she felt, she walked home with her law books in her bag. She would sit by the small lamp in her apartment, drinking cheap coffee to stay awake, reading cases, memorizing statutes, highlighting passages until her eyes blurred. She told herself that this suffering was temporary, that one day she would look back at these nights and know they were worth it. She whispered to herself, "One day, Jane, one day." But that day felt impossibly far away until he walked in. It was late afternoon when Benjamin first stepped into the store. At first, Jane didn't notice him. She was busy rearranging a stack of canned goods after her boss had scolded her for not aligning the labels perfectly. But customers began to whisper, glancing toward the entrance, and Jane finally looked up. And there he was. Benjamin was the kind of man who carried presence without trying. Tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, with dark hair neatly combed back and eyes sharp but kind. He had the quiet confidence of someone who was used to being listened to, respected, maybe even admired. People in the aisles seemed to step aside naturally, as though the universe itself cleared a path for him. To Jane, he looked like he belonged to a different world, one she had only ever seen in the glossy pages of magazines or in the stories classmates told about wealthy families and their limitless opportunities. Jane quickly turned her attention back to her work. People like him didn't notice people like her, and even if they did, it was never for long. She told herself to keep stacking the cans, to focus on the shelf, but she couldn't stop her eyes from flicking back toward him. He walked slowly, scanning the store as though he wasn't in a rush, as though he had all the time in the world. And then, to her surprise, he stopped right in front of her aisle. Jane's heart skipped. She bent lower, pretending to be focused, hoping he would pass by without saying anything. But then, his voice came, low, smooth, polite. "Excuse me, miss. Do you know where I can find the coffee beans?" For a moment, Jane froze. She had answered hundreds of questions from customers before, but somehow her throat tightened. She cleared it quickly. "Yes, aisle 5, just around the corner to the right." Benjamin smiled faintly, his eyes resting on her just a second longer than necessary. "Thank you." She nodded, trying to appear unaffected, but inside her chest, something stirred. It was ridiculous, she told herself. He was just a customer. He would find his coffee, check out, and leave, and she would never see him again. And yet, when she turned back to her shelf, her hands trembled slightly. What Jane didn't realize was that Benjamin had noticed more than she thought. Not just her quick answer, not just the way she tried to keep her head down, but the exhaustion in her eyes mixed with a determination that refused to fade. He had seen people like her before, people who carried burdens heavier than they let on, who fought battles in silence. And though he didn't yet know why, something about her lingered in his mind even as he walked away. A few minutes later, Jane's boss stormed into the aisle. Mr. Clayton's voice cut through the quiet like a blade. "What are you doing standing around? The floor by the registers needs mopping. Go now." His tone was loud, sharp, deliberately humiliating. Customers turned to look. Jane's cheeks burned with shame. She muttered a quick "yes, sir," and hurried away, gripping the mop handle like a lifeline. Benjamin, standing at the end of the aisle, had seen everything. He didn't move immediately, but his jaw tightened. He had grown up in wealth, but his parents had raised him with values, with the understanding that people deserved respect no matter their circumstances. To see a young woman treated like that for no reason stirred something in him. Something protective, something indignant. He watched Jane walk away, her shoulders slightly hunched, and he found himself wanting to know more. Later that evening, when Jane finally clocked out, she walked slowly through the parking lot, her body aching, her mind foggy from fatigue. She carried her heavy bag of books, already planning how she would study late into the night. She didn't notice the car parked at the far end of the lot, a sleek black sedan where Benjamin sat for a moment, lost in thought. He hadn't planned on waiting, hadn't planned on anything more than buying coffee. But something about Jane had unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. And as he watched her walk away into the night, he knew this wasn't the end of their story. It was only the beginning. The next day at the supermarket began like all the others. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above. The smell of disinfectant mixed with fruit and bread filled the air. And Jane forced herself into the rhythm of routine. She tied her apron, pulled her hair back, and prepared for another day of endless demands. She told herself not to think about the man in the tailored suit, the man with eyes that had lingered just long enough to unsettle her. After all, people like him never crossed paths again with people like her. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. At precisely noon, as the sun poured bright light through the glass windows, the door chimed, and Benjamin walked back into the supermarket. This time, Jane noticed immediately. Her chest tightened, though she pretended to focus on wiping down a counter near the bakery section. Why was he here again? Customers like him, wealthy, polished, rarely shopped in this neighborhood twice. Benjamin didn't rush. He strolled casually, as though browsing, but his eyes scanned the aisles with a subtle purpose. When he finally spotted Jane, his expression softened slightly. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm politeness as before. "Excuse me," he said gently. "I hope I'm not bothering you. I realized I bought the wrong kind of coffee yesterday. Would you mind helping me pick the right one?" Jane blinked, surprised. Customers rarely returned just to ask for help with something so trivial. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure whether this was a genuine request or something else entirely. But her upbringing, her manners, pushed her to respond. "Of course," she said quietly, leading him to the aisle. She pointed to the rows of coffee bags, explaining the difference between ground and whole beans, between light and dark roast. She spoke with knowledge and precision, her love for detail slipping out naturally. Benjamin listened carefully, more to the way her voice carried warmth and intelligence than to the explanation itself. When she finished, he nodded thoughtfully. "You seem to know a lot about this. Do you drink much coffee yourself?" Her lips curved into the faintest smile, the first he had seen. "Too much," she admitted. "It helps me stay awake when I study at night." "Study?" he asked, curiosity sparking. She almost regretted saying it. Most people didn't care about her life beyond the apron she wore. But something about his eyes, steady, sincere, made her answer. "Law school," she said. "I'm working my way through." Benjamin's admiration grew instantly. Law school, ambition, determination. He saw the exhaustion in her face, the shadows under her eyes, and suddenly her late nights with coffee made sense. He wanted to ask more, but before he could, a voice cut through the air like a whip. "Jane!" It was Mr. Clayton. His footsteps echoed as he stormed toward them. His face was red with irritation. "Why are you standing here chatting? There's a line at the registers. Move now." Jane's heart sank. She lowered her eyes, mumbling, "Yes, sir," before hurrying away, her cheeks hot with humiliation. She didn't dare look at Benjamin, but Benjamin did look. His jaw tightened. His eyes followed her as she rushed off, and something inside him hardened. He had seen rudeness before, but this open disrespect toward a young woman who was simply doing her job was intolerable. He wanted to step forward, to say something, but he stopped himself. This wasn't his place. Not yet. Instead, he made a quiet decision. This wouldn't be the last time he saw Jane. That evening, Jane sat in her small apartment, the glow of her lamp falling over casebooks stacked on the table. Her hands ached from lifting boxes. Her feet burned from hours of standing, but she forced herself to read. Words blurred on the page, and she leaned back, rubbing her tired eyes. And then, for reasons she couldn't quite explain, her mind drifted back to him. The man in the suit, Benjamin. She remembered the way he had listened, the way he had looked at her as though she mattered, even just for a moment. She told herself it was nothing, just a customer being polite. Yet something inside her stirred, a small, fragile hope she tried to silence. Across the city, Benjamin sat in his penthouse apartment, a glass of wine untouched on the table beside him. His phone buzzed with messages from business associates, dinner invitations, meetings scheduled for the week. He ignored them all. His mind was elsewhere, on a girl in a supermarket uniform with tired eyes and dreams of law school. He had met countless people in his life, but rarely had anyone left such an impression so quickly. He wanted to know her story. He wanted to understand her struggles. And perhaps deep down he wanted to help. The following days unfolded with the quiet persistence of fate. Benjamin returned to the supermarket more often, each time finding a small excuse to cross paths with Jane. Sometimes he asked about products, sometimes he simply greeted her politely. Each time, Jane felt her defenses weaken just slightly. She still kept her distance, reminding herself of the gap between their worlds. But there was something about him, his kindness, his patience, that disarmed her. But not everyone welcomed his presence. Mr. Clayton grew suspicious, watching the interactions with narrowed eyes. One afternoon, when Jane finished helping Benjamin, Clayton cornered her in the stockroom. "What do you think you're doing?" he hissed. "Chatting with customers like you're at a tea party? You're here to work, Jane. Don't embarrass yourself by thinking you're above your position." Jane's throat tightened. She wanted to scream back, to defend herself, but fear of losing her job held her silent. She nodded stiffly, swallowing her pride, and went back to work. Yet Benjamin had seen the way she walked out of the stockroom that day, her shoulders stiff, her eyes clouded. He didn't know what Clayton had said, but he knew it wasn't good. And in that moment, Benjamin made a silent vow. He wouldn't just watch anymore. He would find a way to make a difference in her life. That evening, as the store lights dimmed and Jane finally clocked out, Benjamin was waiting outside. He leaned casually against his car, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert. Jane froze when she saw him. "Benjamin?" she asked softly, uncertain. He smiled gently. "I didn't mean to startle you. I just wanted to make sure you got home safe." Jane blinked, caught between surprise and caution. No one had ever waited for her like this before. "You didn't have to," she murmured. "I know," he replied, "but I wanted to." Something inside her softened at those words. For the first time in a long while, Jane felt seen, not as an employee, not as someone to be ordered around, but as a person. She hesitated, then allowed herself a small smile. And as she walked beside him toward the street, a new chapter began. One that neither of them had expected, but one that would change everything. The following weeks unfolded like the slow turning of seasons, each day pulling Jane deeper into a world she had never imagined she could belong to. Benjamin had become a steady presence in her life, not in the overwhelming, all-consuming way that Jane had always feared rich people might behave, but in a way that felt grounding. He would often stop by the supermarket, not always to buy anything, but to see her. Sometimes he came in late at night when her shift was almost over, holding 2 cups of coffee and insisting she take a break to sit with him in the small staff area out back. Those moments felt stolen, fragile, like delicate pieces of glass she was afraid to drop. For the first time in a long while, Jane felt seen. Not as the tired cashier, not as the girl struggling to pay her tuition, but as a woman whose dreams and determination mattered. Benjamin listened when she spoke about her classes, about how criminal law fascinated her, about how she wanted to fight for people who never had a chance. His eyes lit up when she spoke of her future, and she couldn't help but feel that he was beginning to believe in her even more than she believed in herself. But the brighter Benjamin's presence became in her life, the darker her reality at the supermarket grew. Her boss, Mr. Harris, seemed to sense that Jane was happier, lighter, and it infuriated him. He began piling extra shifts on her, criticizing her in front of customers, finding petty reasons to keep her from leaving on time. One evening, as Benjamin waited outside for her after her shift, Harris sneered and said loud enough for her to hear, "Must be nice to have someone waiting with a fancy car while you're here scrubbing the floors." Jane felt her face burn, but she swallowed her pride, keeping her eyes down, because she knew that if she snapped back, Harris could make her life unbearable. Still, Benjamin noticed the toll it was taking. One night, after she finally left the store long after closing, she found him leaning against his car with a worried expression. "You're exhausted," he said softly, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "He's pushing you too hard." Jane tried to laugh it off, but the truth was undeniable. She was burning herself out. Her grades were slipping, her health was fraying, and the weight of trying to balance everything was beginning to crush her. "Benjamin," she whispered, "I can't let him win. I can't quit. If I lose this job, I lose everything I've worked for. My tuition, my apartment. It all depends on this paycheck." He looked at her with a kind of anguish that only someone helpless to fix a problem feels. He could have paid her tuition 10 times over without blinking, but he knew Jane would never accept that. Her pride, her independence, her determination to stand on her own 2 feet, those were the pillars of who she was. And Benjamin loved her for that. It was in those small battles, her refusal to be broken, his constant support, that their love grew stronger. Yet, Jane couldn't ignore the voice in her head, whispering that their worlds were too different. She lived in a cramped apartment with peeling paint and secondhand furniture. He lived in a sprawling mansion with staff who catered to his every need. She wore supermarket uniforms and bought clothes from thrift shops. He wore tailored suits that probably cost more than her rent. What if, in the end, those differences were too much to bridge? One Saturday morning, Benjamin invited her to a charity gala. First, Jane laughed, thinking he was joking. "Me? At a gala?" she said, glancing down at her worn-out sneakers. But Benjamin was serious. "I want you there with me," he said firmly. "Not as someone I'm helping, not as someone who doesn't belong, but as my guest, as someone I care about." Jane's heart pounded with both excitement and dread. She had never stepped foot in a ballroom, never worn an evening gown, never mingled with the elite. Her entire being screamed that she would be out of place. Yet something in Benjamin's eyes convinced her to try. The night of the gala, Jane stood in front of her mirror in a simple dress she had rented with money she couldn't really spare. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the straps, terrified she would embarrass herself. But when Benjamin arrived to pick her up, his eyes widened, and for a moment he was speechless. "Jane," he whispered, his voice thick with awe, "you're breathtaking." For a few hours that night, Jane felt like she was living in a dream. The chandeliers sparkled above her, the music wrapped around her like a warm embrace, and Benjamin never let go of her hand. People whispered as they passed, some smiling politely, others with thinly veiled judgment. Jane felt their stares, felt the weight of their assumptions, but every time doubt crept in, Benjamin would lean close and whisper something that made her laugh, reminding her that she wasn't there to impress anyone but herself. but not everyone approved. As the night wore on, a woman approached Benjamin with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Benjamin," she said, her gaze flickering to Jane with disdain. "I didn't realize you were bringing company." Jane's stomach twisted, and for a moment, she wanted to disappear into the floor. But Benjamin tightened his grip on her hand and introduced Jane with pride in his voice. "This is Jane. She's studying law. She's brilliant." That moment stayed with Jane long after the gala ended. For the first time, someone had not only accepted her but defended her right to be in a place she had always believed was off-limits. And yet, when she returned to her small apartment that night, slipping off the rented dress and staring at her reflection in the mirror, she felt a sharp ache in her chest. Could she really belong in Benjamin's world? Or was she simply living a borrowed dream? The answer came sooner than she expected. A week later, at the supermarket, Mr. Harris cornered her in the break room. "So," he said with a smirk, "you think you're better than us now? Walking around with that rich guy on your arm?" His voice dripped with bitterness. Jane's hands clenched at her sides, but she kept her voice steady. "I don't think I'm better than anyone. I'm just trying to live my life." Harris laughed coldly. "Don't fool yourself, Jane. People like you don't end up with people like him. He'll get bored, and when he does, you'll come crawling back here, begging for more hours." His words cut deep, not because she believed them, but because part of her feared he might be right. That night, when Benjamin came to pick her up, he found her sitting on the curb outside the store, her head buried in her hands. Without a word, he sat beside her, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. For a long time, she didn't speak. Then finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "What if he's right? What if I'm just a passing phase for you?" Benjamin turned her face toward his eyes fierce. "Jane, listen to me. You are not a phase. You are not temporary. You are the most extraordinary person I have ever met. And if you can't see that yet, then I'll spend every day proving it to you until you believe it." Tears blurred Jane's vision, and in that moment, something shifted inside her. She realized that love wasn't about matching backgrounds or fitting neatly into the same world. It was about standing together against every doubt, every obstacle, every cruel word thrown their way. And Benjamin was choosing to stand with her no matter what. But the universe wasn't finished testing them. Just as Jane began to believe in their future, a storm was brewing on the horizon. One that would challenge everything they thought they knew about love, sacrifice, and the courage to fight for what truly mattered. The storm came quietly at first, in whispers and shadows, in subtle moments that Jane could not quite name. Benjamin's visits grew less frequent, his phone buzzing constantly with calls he never explained. His gaze often distant even when he was sitting right beside her. She tried to ignore it, to remind herself that he was a man with responsibilities she couldn't begin to understand. But her heart trembled with the fear that maybe her boss's cruel words had carried some truth. One evening, as they sat in a small diner after her shift, Benjamin reached across the table and took her hand. His eyes were serious, the kind of serious that made her stomach twist. "Jane," he said softly, "there's something I haven't told you." Her pulse quickened. "What is it?" He hesitated, then sighed. "My family, they don't approve of us. They think you're not the right kind of woman for me. They've been pressuring me to end things before it gets too serious." The words cut deeper than any insult Harris had ever thrown at her. Jane pulled her hand back, her throat tight. "So, am I just a problem for you to solve?" she whispered. Benjamin shook his head fiercely. "No, you're not a problem. You're the answer I never knew I was searching for. But I need you to understand, this won't be easy. If I choose you, I'll be walking away from their approval, from the path they've laid out for me. And I'd do it 100 times over. But it means we'll face more battles. Together." Jane's chest ached, torn between love and fear. "I don't want to be the reason you lose everything," she said quietly. Benjamin leaned forward, his voice steady. "You're not the reason I lose anything. You're the reason I gain everything that matters." His words lit a fire in her heart, but doubts still gnawed at her. That night, alone in her apartment, Jane stared at her stack of textbooks, her schedule full of classes and endless shifts at the supermarket, and she wondered, could she really be enough for a man who came from a world so different from hers? The answer came in the form of a choice. A week later, Harris pushed her too far. In front of customers, he humiliated her, accusing her of stealing from the register when the numbers didn't add up. Jane knew it was a mistake in the system, but he refused to listen, shouting until her hands shook. For the first time, Jane didn't lower her gaze. She looked him straight in the eye and said, "I don't deserve this. I'm done." The words shocked even her. Quitting meant losing her paycheck, risking her tuition, facing the unknown. But as she walked out of the store for the last time, her heart felt lighter than it had in years. Benjamin was waiting for her outside, and when she told him what had happened, his eyes filled with pride. "That's the Jane I know," he said, pulling her into his arms. "The woman who refuses to let anyone break her." But even as he held her, she knew the hardest battles were still ahead. Benjamin's family would not stay silent, and the world would not stop reminding them of their differences. The question was not whether their love was real, it was whether it was strong enough to survive the storm. That night, Jane made a decision. She wasn't going to let fear or pride hold her back anymore. She wasn't going to push Benjamin away to protect him from losing his world. Instead, she would fight for their future just as fiercely as she fought for her dreams of becoming a lawyer. Because love, she realized, was not about perfection. It was about courage, and she had more of it than she had ever known. And so, with her job behind her and her future ahead, Jane stepped into a new chapter of her life. One where the lines between their worlds blurred, and the possibility of something extraordinary grew brighter with every step. Little did she know, the next turn in their journey would bring the most surprising twist yet, one that would test not just their love, but their very understanding of what it meant to build a life together. The storm they feared came crashing in faster than either of them expected. It started with whispers, hushed conversations Jane caught when she walked into rooms where Benjamin had been speaking on the phone. His family was relentless. They sent messages, warnings, even threats about cutting him off completely if he refused to let her go. Jane felt the weight of it pressing down on her chest every day. She could see the exhaustion in Benjamin's eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. He tried to shield her from it, but she knew. She knew how heavy it must feel to be forced to choose between the life he was born into and the love they had found together. One evening, after a long day of her law classes, Jane invited Benjamin to her tiny apartment for dinner. She had cooked a simple pasta dish, nervous that it might pale in comparison to the fine meals he was used to. But Benjamin smiled as though it was the most beautiful feast he'd ever seen. As they sat at the small kitchen table, the flickering candlelight dancing between them, Jane finally spoke the fear that had been clawing at her heart. "Benjamin, what if they're right?" His brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" She stared at her hands, twisting them together. "What if I'm holding you back? You could have anyone. A woman who fits into your world, who your family would accept. You wouldn't have to fight every day just to love me." Benjamin reached across the table, lifting her chin until their eyes met. His voice was steady, filled with a certainty she envied. "Jane, I don't want a woman who fits into their world. I want the woman who fits into mine. And that's you. Do you understand? I don't care if the world doesn't see it yet. I see it. And I will never let you go." Tears filled her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming weight of being loved so fiercely. She realized then that Benjamin wasn't choosing between two worlds. He was building a new one with her. Still, the days that followed were not easy. The supermarket had replaced her within a week, and money was tight. Jane picked up shifts tutoring students in law classes and even cleaned houses on weekends just to stay afloat. Benjamin offered to help, but she refused to rely on his wealth. She needed to stand on her own feet, not just for herself but to prove to him, and to herself, that she was strong enough to walk beside him as an equal. Benjamin admired her even more for it. He often told her that her strength was the very thing that drew him in from the beginning. But deep down, Jane wondered how long he would be willing to fight his family for a future with her. The answer came unexpectedly. One Saturday afternoon, Benjamin invited Jane to a charity gala hosted by his parents. She was terrified, but he insisted. If we want a future together, they need to see who you are, not the story they've created in their heads. Trust me. Jane wore the only elegant dress she owned, a soft blue gown she had bought secondhand. She walked into the ballroom at Benjamin's side, her head held high despite the whispers she could feel cutting through the air. His parents watched her with cold, assessing eyes, and more than one guest whispered behind champagne glasses as she passed. But Jane refused to shrink. She smiled, she introduced herself kindly, and when the time came, she spoke passionately to a group about her dreams of becoming a lawyer and helping people who couldn't afford justice. For the first time, she didn't feel small in their world. She felt powerful. Benjamin watched her with pride burning in his eyes. And though his parents said little that night, Jane knew she had left an impression. Later, when the gala ended, Benjamin held her hand as they walked out into the cool night air. "Do you see now?" he whispered. "You belong everywhere, Jane. You don't need to change for anyone." Her heart swelled at his words, and she realized she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was becoming the woman she was meant to be. But as beautiful as the evening had been, Jane knew the story was far from over. There was still the question of Benjamin's inheritance, his family's power, and the life he might have to give up for her. And she couldn't help but wonder, could love truly be strong enough to rewrite the ending of a story everyone else thought they already knew? The answer would come soon, sooner than either of them expected, and it would change everything. The morning after the gala, Benjamin woke up to an envelope slipped under his apartment door. He recognized his father's handwriting instantly. For a moment, his chest tightened. He knew what it meant before he even opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was an ultimatum. His family had decided that unless he ended things with Jane, he would be cut off completely. No inheritance, no shares in the family business, no safety net. Benjamin sat at the kitchen table, staring at the letter. For years, that fortune had been dangled in front of him like a chain disguised as gold. He thought of the endless board meetings, the carefully chosen parties, the rigid life that was expected of him. Then he thought of Jane, of her smile when she talked about the law, the fire in her eyes when she stood up for herself, the way she never bowed to anyone's judgment. The choice was clear. That evening, Benjamin drove to Jane's apartment. She could see the tension in his shoulders as soon as he walked in, and her heart sank. "What happened?" she asked softly. He handed her the letter. She read it in silence, her hands trembling. By the time she finished, her eyes were wide with fear. "Benjamin, this is your entire life, your future. You can't just—" "Yes, I can," he interrupted gently, taking her hands. "Because my future isn't in that letter. It's sitting right in front of me." Tears spilled down Jane's cheeks, but this time she didn't protest. She knew he meant every word, and for the first time, she allowed herself to fully believe in their love without fear of what the world would think. News of Benjamin's decision spread quickly. The society pages whispered about the young heir who had walked away from his family fortune for a woman who worked in a supermarket. Some mocked, some pitied, but others admired. And Benjamin? He didn't care what anyone said. He was free. Jane, too, felt a change inside her. She had always dreamed of becoming a lawyer to help others who were overlooked, ignored, or judged unfairly, just as she had been. With Benjamin's unwavering support, she studied harder than ever, fueled by the fire of their shared struggles. Months passed. Benjamin took a job managing a local nonprofit that helped provide food and shelter for families in need. He poured himself into it, finding joy not in wealth, but in service. Jane admired the way he had reinvented himself, not as the man the world wanted him to be, but as the man he chose to become. And then, the day she had been waiting for finally arrived. After years of exhaustion, long nights, and countless sacrifices, Jane stood in a courtroom with her diploma in hand, officially sworn in as a lawyer. Benjamin sat in the front row, his eyes shining with pride. When the ceremony ended, Jane walked straight to him. "We did it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "No," Benjamin corrected, pulling her into his arms. "You did it. and I couldn't be prouder. But the biggest surprise was still to come. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the city skyline, Benjamin took Jane to the same small cafe where they had shared their first meal together after her terrible day at the supermarket. The same place where he had seen the strength in her eyes and known, without a doubt, that she was different from everyone else. They sat at the same table, laughter and memories spilling between them. Then Benjamin grew quiet. He reached into his pocket, his hands trembling just slightly. "Jane," he began, his voice low and filled with emotion. "When I walked away from everything, people said I was crazy. They said I was throwing away my future. But they didn't understand. My future isn't something you inherit. It's something you build with the right person. And I want to build mine with you." He placed a small velvet box on the table and opened it, revealing a simple, elegant ring. "Will you marry me?" For a moment, Jane couldn't breathe. Her hand flew to her mouth, her heart pounding as tears blurred her vision. All the pain, all the struggles, all the humiliation she had endured felt as though they had led her to this exact moment. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking with joy. 1,000 times yes. Benjamin slipped the ring onto her finger, and the cafe erupted in applause from the few customers who had witnessed the proposal. Jane laughed through her tears, clinging to him as though she never wanted to let go. In that moment, neither of them cared about the fortune lost, the gossip whispered, or the battles fought. They had chosen each other, and that was all that mattered. Years later, Jane became known as one of the most respected lawyers in the city, fighting tirelessly for those who had no voice. Benjamin built a foundation that changed countless lives, using his knowledge and influence not for power, but for good. Together, they created a life richer than any fortune could provide. A life built not on privilege or appearances, but on love, respect, and the courage to defy the world. And whenever Jane looked down at the simple ring on her finger, she remembered the day she thought she was too small, too invisible to ever matter. She remembered the cruel words of her old boss, the whispers of Benjamin's world, the nights of doubt, and she smiled because she knew she had been wrong. She had always mattered, and now she had found someone who saw it too. Love had not only rewritten her story, it had given her the ending she never dared to dream.